Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. December 7th, 1941. Air elements of the Empire of Japan strike Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, catching U.S. forces completely by surprise. As the 350 or so Nakajima B-5 and Kate bombers, HE-D-3A Val dive bombers, and Mitsubishi A-6M Zeros struck and did their worst. Only 5 U.S. pilots, some of them still wearing their pajamas or their dress pants from the carefree events of the night before, got airborne that day to hit back. Of the 29 Japanese aircraft shot down that day, 10 were knocked down by these brave young pilots who were in the right place at the right time in order to be first in the fight. Just like the Curtiss Warbirds they were flying. Let's take a close look at this iconic series of aircraft that were there at the very beginning and shouldered the brunt of the fight through some of the darkest days of the conflict. The P-40 was actually an update of an earlier aircraft, the P-36 Hawk, which had been a private venture of the Curtiss Aircraft Company. The P-36 Hawk was a bit shorter in length, without the big air scoop in the nose, and with a Wright XR-1670 radial engine instead. The prototype first flew in 1934. Curtiss built a little over 1,000 of them, and they were used by several countries, including Brazil and China. Argentina amazingly kept some of theirs in service until 1954. The British called the P-36 the Mohawk, and they did assess the type, but found them inferior to their own Spitfires. Although the RAF decided to not buy the Mohawks, they ended up with several hundred anyway. These were supposed to go to the French, but were never delivered as France had already been occupied by German forces. Prototypes. The first Warhawk was actually a modified P-36 Hawk, with the radial engine being replaced by a liquid-cooled Allison V12 engine. Although this engine had basically the same amount of power as the radial, it did have a smaller frontal area, which promised greater streamlining, which in turn would reduce drag and increase speed. As the engine was liquid-cooled, it needed a radiator somewhere, and so, in the beginning at least, the scoop was placed under the belly of the aircraft, just aft of the trailing edge of the wing. The prototype first flew in October 1938, and initially the test pilot was disappointed with the 315 mph performance of the XP-40, as the experimental aircraft was designated. But the Curtiss company did not give up on the type. They did wind tunnel testing and made adjustments, such as incorporating the oil cooler into the air scoop and moving it up to the chin, where it would become the major distinguishing feature of the fighter. Although the P-40 is easily recognized by the big radiator and oil cooler scoop below the nose, many folks don't realize that many variants also have a smaller carburetor scoop above the nose. Curtiss designers also modified the landing gear doors and exhaust manifold in order to squeeze 55 more miles per hour out of the type, finally achieving 366 miles per hour. Production. In April 1939, the United States Air Corps placed its largest order ever and asked for 524 P-40s. Another early order came from France for 230 fighters, but these were not built before France had already been knocked out of the war. As I mentioned earlier, once they came out of the factory in Buffalo, New York, these aircraft were then supplied to the British Commonwealth, where they were called Tomahawk 1s. Initially, P-40s were armed with 2 30-caliber machine guns in each wing and 2 short-barreled synchronized 50-caliber machine guns mounted in the nose cowling, shooting through the propeller disc. This firepower was found to be inadequate in combat, and later on, the synchronized 50 caliber machine guns were removed from the nose, and the 30 caliber guns in the wings were swapped for two 50s in each wing. During the war, many changes were made to the Warhawk. The P-40B had protection added to the fuel system, while demands for more range and combat versatility had drop tank and bomb shackles added to the P-40C. The P-40E had a more powerful engine and thus a larger air scoop to help in cooling the engine. Further requests for more firepower had another 50 caliber machine gun added to each wing, bringing the total to 6. The P-40F and L were installed with Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. These can be recognized by their lack of carburetor scoops above the nose. As they were considered more stripped down than other P-40 variants, they were sometimes called Gypsy Rose Lees, after the famous burlesque stripper of the time. The P-40s with the Merlins perform better at high altitudes, which was always the downfall of the Allison engine. The G and K variants were mainly supplied to the Soviet Union and Commonwealth units. The P-40M had an even more powerful Allison engine and a stretched fuselage to help counter the increased torque. The P-40N was the last production model of the type, with a cut-down rear fuselage to increase rear visibility. Curtiss also built a few experimental variants, such as the Q and the twin P-40. The Q had a bubble canopy and a cut-down rear fuselage. Unlike all the other P-40s, which were installed with a 1-speed supercharger and a 3-bladed prop, the Q had a 4-bladed prop and a 2-speed supercharger. And it looks a lot like a later Mustang or Spitfire. Although it was the fastest Warhawk ever, it was not put into production. The strangest looking Warhawk was a single example built with twin engines installed in the wings, on top of the landing gear. It looks a little like a British Westland Whirlwind. Operational history. Although the Warhawk may be chiefly remembered for its role in China as the weapon of the famed Flying Tigers, it also served with distinction in Europe and especially in North Africa with the UK's Desert Air Force, where they were brought in to replace Hawker Hurricanes. P-40 served with squadrons of many Commonwealth countries, including the Royal Air Force, the South African Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, and the Royal Canadian Air Force. The British called their P-40s Tomahawks. However, from the D model onward, they called them Kitty Hawks. British-trained pilots did have to get used to the particularities of the P-40, especially in landing. The rear-folding landing gear of the P-40 was more liable to collapse than of the Spitfire or Hurricane, and pilots had to learn to do a main gear first type landing rather than a 3-point landing that they were used to. P-40s did a good chunk of the fighting in the desert, where at lower altitudes they were considered equal or slightly superior to the Bf-109s and Italian Fiat G50s and the Macchi C200s and Macchi C202 Folgore that were their main opponents. The P-40 was well suited to the tough conditions of the desert. Its sturdy construction could handle operations from rough airstrips and was strong enough to absorb much high G aerobatics and battle damage and bring its pilot home. There were even reports of P-40s surviving mid-air collisions and even deliberate ramming attacks. It was constructed in a semi-modular manner, which meant that it was easier to maintain in the field. One place where the P-40 was not to be found was at high altitudes in the skies of northwestern Europe. Due to the limitations of the single-stage, low-altitude rated supercharger, the P-40's engine just didn't have the power and thus the performance above 15,000 feet to compete. These high altitudes were to be the domain of the Spitfires and later the Mustangs. However, where the P-40 has really earned its place in aviation history and mythology is in China with the Flying Tigers, which was officially known as the First American Volunteer Group, AVG. The Flying Tigers initially received P-40B models. The planes came with no radios or capacity to carry extra fuel in drop tanks. The leader of the Flying Tigers, Colonel Claire Chennault, was skeptical about using the P-40. He worried that the liquid-cooled engines would be too vulnerable. One bullet in the cooling system would mean that the engine was finished. He also realized the limitations of the lack of a turbo supercharger. Finally, the P-40 was just not as maneuverable as its light and nimble Japanese foes, the Nakajima Ki-27 Kate and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar. Some even thought the Flying Tigers were getting the P-40 because nobody else wanted to use it. Although the P-40 had its faults, Colonel Chennault saw that the P-40 had some advantages. It was ruggedly built and had armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. It was well armed and faster in a dive than its Japanese opponents. Chennault was able to see the aircraft's pluses to good advantage and encouraged his pilots to use boom and zoom tactics, hitting the enemy hard and then diving to get away without engaging in slow-speed dogfights, where the P-40 was less maneuverable and thus at a disadvantage. One of the main problems for the Flying Tigers was supply. Firstly, as the AVG was not technically part of the United States military, the aircraft were shipped to China without government-furnished material, such as gun sights, guns, or radios. These had to be scrounged and added in the field. In China, the AVG was at the end of a very long and precarious supply tail, and spare parts and replacement aircraft were always in short supply. Interestingly enough, although the Flying Tigers are often thought of as the ones to first paint the shark's teeth on the noses of their aircraft, it was actually copied from No. 112 Squadron of the Royal Air Force. They were flying P-40s in the desert of North Africa, and they had copied the idea of the shark's teeth from the Luftwaffe's Zerstorgeschwader 76, who had painted it on the noses of their Messerschmitt Bf-110s. The Flying Tigers began combat operations only 12 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor and were a welcome boost to American morale at that point in the war. In the end, they destroyed 296 enemy aircraft while losing only 12 of their own pilots. Eventually, the AVG was inducted into the United States Army Air Force. Although many considered the P-40 to be inadequate and even obsolete at the start of the war, initially much of the fighting was done by this type of aircraft. As the newer Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, and North American P-51 Mustangs came online, many units converted to these from their P-40s. P-40s served with many nations, including the Soviet Union, which received several hundred through Lend-Lease. The Soviets had mixed feelings about the P-40s. Being fairly desperate for equipment, they were certainly glad to get whatever aircraft they got. However, they did not consider the P-40 to be the best. One thing that they didn't like was the underpowered engine. This problem was compounded in their efforts to try to squeeze more power out of that engine. Soviet pilots were known to shove the throttle to wartime emergency setting and keep it there. This led to engines being quickly burned out. It didn't help that the fuel and oil supplies that the Soviets were using to service the engines were not of the same quality or purity that the Allison engines were used to. Soviet pilots considered the P-40 to be better than the Hawker Hurricane, although not as good as their own Yak-1s. But, like everywhere else we've looked, the P-40 was a good airplane, and even better in the fact that it was there, in the right place at the right time. For maybe they couldn't claim to win the war, they could be said to have prevented it from being lost. And sometimes that's just what is needed. Survivors. There are some types of warbirds that are very difficult to get to see in person. The P-40 is not one of them. There are many examples of surviving P-40s, either in the process of restoration or on display, and many of them are airworthy. The UK has at least 3 flying examples, and the US has almost 30. I have personally laid eyes on the airworthy P-40 Kitty Hawk at Vintage Wings of Canada in Gatineau, Quebec. It is painted in the Desert Air Force markings of RAF 260 Squadron to honor Canadian pilot wing commander James "Stocky" Edwards. His story and what he did with his P-40 Kitty Hawk just might be the subject of an upcoming video. If you don't want to miss it, or any other Warbird videos, please subscribe to this channel. If you liked what you saw today, give us a like, and you can always join in the conversation by commenting. Thanks for watching.